#Antifa. No, Biden did not defy a Supreme Court order. This is another Know Your Douchebags offering from Radio Free America. Like, comment, share. It's free and we stand to learn something together through substantive discourse. It's one of the biggest and scariest questions in American democracy in many years. Will the Trump administration plunge us headlong into a constitutional crisis by defying a court order? A growing procession of judges have halted President Donald Trump's many legally dubious actions. He and those around him have responded by appearing to lay the groundwork for ignoring those courts, if they aren't already ignoring them. And if and when we get to that point, it's likely you'll hear plenty of whataboutism from the Trump allies who might defend it. What about the time that then-President Joe Biden defied not just a court order, but the Supreme Court? Elon Musk and others are already barking up that tree. So, for the record, Biden did not defy the Supreme Court. You could fault Biden for how he talked about working around the Supreme Court's decision on student loan forgiveness. You could also fault him for doing something he and other Democrats wagered ahead of time wouldn't pass legal muster. But he did not do what the Supreme Court told him he couldn't. It's complicated, but it's worth running through, given the current state of play. To recap. 1. In August 2022, Biden signed an executive order that would forgive up to $10,000 in student loans for most borrowers, totaling about $430 billion. He did so even as he and other prominent Democrats such as then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat California, had suggested that Biden couldn't do this without congressional approval. 2. After a legal fight, the Supreme Court in June 2023 indeed struck down the program. It ruled that it represented an exhaustive rewriting of the law, which you're not allowed to do by executive action. 3. Biden quickly signaled that he would work around the ruling to provide student debt relief for many borrowers. We'll use every tool at our disposal to get you the student debt relief you need and reach your dreams, he said. He later took actions that relied on different existing laws to provide more targeted student loan relief. It helped fewer borrowers and cost less, and it relied on what's known as income-driven repayment rather than immediate forgiveness. But his saving on a valuable education program was also later blocked by the Supreme Court. The key point here is that Biden didn't just go and do what the Supreme Court told him he couldn't. The Supreme Court didn't say you can't provide student loan relief, period. It said he couldn't forgive the debt via the method he initially tried. He then tried other, more targeted methods to relieve the burden. But Biden certainly gave Republicans fodder with how he talked about his efforts to work around the Supreme Court ruling. He often pitched it as the justices trying to block him, and him persevering. 1. The Supreme Court blocked my original plan to help more than 40 million working and middle-class American students get relief, he added in July. But they couldn't stop me. 2. I promised to ease student debt for millions of folks, he said in January on X. The Supreme Court blocked me, but it didn't stop me. 3. The Supreme Court tried to block me from relieving student debt, Biden said in May in the post shared by Musk on Tuesday. But they didn't stop me. Biden was pitching this as the conservative-leaning Supreme Court standing in the way of helping millions of Americans, but him not letting it. The potential political appeal of that pitch is evident. Biden was still seeking re-election when he made these comments, but ever since then it's been used by Republicans as evidence of Biden's alleged disregard for the rule of law. People can debate whether it amounts to that. Biden at the very least did something he suggested he couldn't and pitched himself as circumventing the Supreme Court. He at other points was more careful to clarify that he was doing things that were different from what the Supreme Court told him he couldn't. He at another point signed an executive order extending the COVID-era eviction moratorium, despite the White House having repeatedly said it couldn't do that by executive order. Biden at the time brazenly suggested it was quite likely it would get struck down. Indeed, the Supreme Court had already signaled that this would require congressional authorization, but he said it would at least help people in the meantime. In other words, yes, it's probably illegal, but it's worth it. But all of that is different from having a court tell you that you can't do something specific, and then doing it anyway. If Biden had in fact defied the Supreme Court, his critics could have asked judges to hold him and his administration in contempt, touching off a true constitutional crisis. There's a reason none of that ever happened. But that is what we're talking about now. Indeed, a judge on Monday ruled that the Trump administration had violated the judge's order halting the administration's freeze on federal funding. The judge didn't say whether it was intentionally defying the order. But in issuing the ruling, he noted that those who make private determinations of the law and refuse to obey an order generally risk criminal contempt. Trump and company have also spoken more openly about defying court orders. Vice President J.D. Vance has repeatedly laid out the circumstances in which this would supposedly be warranted. The idea is that the courts would be infringing on the constitutional powers of the executive. This type of nuance has often fallen victim to an era of politics that has increasingly little regard for fact-checking and in which Trump and his allies, especially, have exploited whataboutism. But as we approach the precipice, it's worth understanding that this comparison just isn't apples to apples. This has been another Know Your Douchebags dispatch from Radio Free America. Like, comment, share. It's free. #FuckTheCake. #EatTheRich. #Antifa.